Caleb Thorne watched the snow begin to fall from the narrow window of his cabin, each flake a tiny ghost descending upon the vast, silent wilderness of the Montana Territory. The wind was picking up, its voice a low moan through the pines that crowded his land like ancient sentinels. For 5 years, this had been his world. The sharp scent of pine, the bite of the cold, the profound quiet that settled over the mountains, and he hoped, over the war that still echoed in the deepest parts of him. Solitude was not a punishment. It was a sanctuary he had built with his own 2 hands, a fortress against a world that had taken everything and offered only noise and pain in return. He pulled on his worn sheepskin coat, the familiar weight a comfort against his shoulders. It was his day for town, a bi-monthly ritual he endured with grim necessity. The trip to Flat River was a long ride, and the encroaching winter meant it was likely his last until the spring thaw. He needed salt, flour, coffee, and cartridges. Nothing more. The town was a place of people, and people were a complication he had long since learned to live without. They brought expectations and disappointments. Their lives tangled knots he had no desire to touch, let alone unravel. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Boulder, snorted a plume of steam into the frigid air as Caleb cinched the saddle. The animal was his only constant companion, and their communication was one of silent understanding. A touch, a quiet word, it was all that was needed. Boulder was a creature of this land, steady and uncomplicated, and Caleb valued that more than any human conversation. He mounted, settling into the worn leather, and urged the horse down the barely there trail that led from his high country hermitage toward the distant cluster of buildings that passed for civilization. The ride was a meditation in gray and white. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of a blizzard. The skeletal branches of aspens clawed at the air, and the evergreens wore a dusting of fresh snow on their boughs. Caleb's gaze swept the landscape, a habit ingrained from years of survival, both in war and in this wilderness. He noted the track of a deer, the distant cry of a hawk, the way the wind sculpted drifts against the lee side of the ridges. This was a language he understood. It was honest. The wilderness could kill a man, but it would never lie to him. Flat River was just as he remembered it. A single muddy street flanked by false-fronted buildings, a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses huddled together, as if for warmth. Smoke curled from stone chimneys, a fragile sign of life against the immense, indifferent backdrop of the mountains. He tied Boulder to the hitching post outside Miller's Mercantile, the sound of a hammer on anvil from the smithy the only thing breaking the tense quiet that preceded a storm. Inside, the store was warm, smelling of coffee, cured leather, and wood smoke. Mr. Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles, gave him a curt nod. Caleb returned it, his own expression unreadable. He moved through the store with quiet efficiency, gathering his supplies. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders, and he moved with a stillness that could be mistaken for menace, though it was born of a deep-seated caution. His face, weathered by sun and wind, was framed by dark hair that had grown long over the winter, and his eyes were the color of a stormy sky, holding a distance that discouraged approach. He was at the counter, counting out his payment, when he saw her. She was standing near a small stack of fir trees leaned against the wall, their green a vibrant shock in the store's dim interior. She was talking to Miller's wife, her voice low but clear. Caleb did not mean to listen, but the small space and the woman's earnest tone made it impossible not to. "I understand, Martha," she said, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "It is just—" Thomas was so looking forward to it. "It is his first Christmas since his father." Her voice faltered, a small break that she quickly controlled. Martha Miller sighed, her expression a mixture of pity and practicality. "I'm sorry, Eleanor. Truly. But Sterling Croft bought up the whole lot. Said he wanted them for the big party at his ranch. He paid a premium, and you know how my husband is about business." Caleb glanced at the woman, really looking at her for the first time. She was slender, dressed in a simple but well-kept black dress that marked her as a widow. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, though a few strands had escaped to frame a face that was pale with cold and worry. It was a fine-boned face, one that spoke of a gentler life than this harsh territory offered. But it was her eyes that held him. They were a deep, clear blue, and in them he saw not just sadness, but a fierce, quiet pride that refused to crumble in a public despair. She was trying to buy a Christmas tree and had been denied. A simple thing, a foolish, sentimental thing. And yet, the sight of her standing there, so dignified in her disappointment, stirred something in him he had long thought buried. Eleanor Vance forced a small, polite smile. "Of course, I understand completely. Thank you for your time." She turned to leave, her shoulders straight, her head held high. But as she passed the window, just before she stepped out into the biting wind, Caleb saw her pause. She lifted a gloved hand to her eye, a quick, furtive gesture to wipe away a tear that had betrayed her composure. The sight struck Caleb with the force of a physical blow. It was the quietness of her grief, the attempt to hide it, that pierced the armor he had so carefully constructed around his heart. He had seen men die screaming on the battlefield, had witnessed horrors that would break the stoutest spirit, but this small, private moment of a woman's sorrow over a child's Christmas tree felt heavier, more personal. It was a pain born not of violence, but of love and loss. He finished his transaction, his movements stiff. He loaded his supplies onto the pack mule tethered behind Boulder, his mind a turmoil of conflicting impulses. "Leave it be," the solitary part of him commanded. "It is not your concern. You came here to be left alone." But the image of her face, of that single tear, would not leave him. He remembered Christmases from before the war, the scent of pine in a warm house, the glow of candlelight, the face of his own mother, long gone now. He remembered the simple joys that the world seemed so determined to crush. Damn it all. He mounted Boulder, turning not toward the trail back to his cabin, but in the direction the woman had gone. He rode slowly, keeping a respectable distance. He saw her enter a small, neat cabin at the edge of town, one that looked lonely and inadequate against the looming storm. A small boy, no more than 6 or 7, ran out to greet her, his face falling when he saw her hands were empty. Caleb watched as she knelt, hugged the boy tightly, and led him back inside. Caleb sat on his horse, the snow beginning to fall faster, melting on the warm leather of his coat. He was a fool. He was getting involved. But the man he had been before the war, the man his father had raised him to be, would not let him ride away. That man, buried under years of grief and isolation, still believed in a code. And that code said you did not let a child's hope die if you had the power to prevent it. He turned Boulder around and rode back toward the mountains, but not toward his own trail. He rode toward a stand of young firs he knew, a place where the trees grew straight and full, perfect for a boy who needed to believe in a little bit of magic in a world that had too little of it. Eleanor closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment to gather herself. The cold from outside seemed to have seeped into her bones, a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Thomas looked up at her, his small face a canvas of hopeful expectation. "Did you get it, Mama?" he asked, his voice small. She forced a bright smile, though it felt brittle enough to shatter. "Not today, my love. All the trees in town were already spoken for. But we will make our own decorations, and we will sing carols, and it will still be a wonderful Christmas." She hated the lie, hated the false cheer at her voice. Since her husband, Edward, had passed from fever the previous spring, their life had become a series of such pretenses, of pretending they were not one step away from destitution, of pretending her heart was not a hollow ache in her chest. Thomas's lower lip trembled, but he nodded bravely. He was a good boy, too good. He had learned to swallow his disappointments far too early in his young life. "Arif, Mama." She hugged him fiercely, burying her face in his soft hair, breathing in the scent of him. He was all she had left of Edward, all she had left of the life they had dreamed of building here in the West. They had come from Boston with such high hopes, Edward's position as a geologist for the railroad promising a prosperous future. But the frontier gave no quarter. It had taken her husband, their savings, and her social standing, leaving her with little more than a small widow's pension and the sewing she took in from the townswomen. It was enough to survive, but some days survival felt like a punishment. Today was one of those days. The humiliation in the store had been twofold. First, the quiet refusal from Martha Miller, a woman who had been her friend when Edward was alive. Second, the presence of Sterling Croft, who had been lingering by the counter. He had overheard the exchange, and the look he gave her, a smug, proprietary smile, had made her skin crawl. Croft owned the largest ranch in the valley, and since Edward's death, he had made his intentions clear. He saw her as a beautiful, well-bred widow who would make a fine ornament for his grand house. His offers of help were always laced with an implicit price she was unwilling to pay. His buying all the trees felt like another one of his calculated moves, another way to remind her of her dependence and his power. And then there had been the other man, the one at the counter. She had felt his eyes on her. He was a mountain man, by the looks of him. Rough, solitary, with a stillness about him that was both intimidating and intriguing. His gaze had not been leering like Croft's, nor pitying like Martha's. It had been observant, as if he were seeing right through the careful facade she presented to the world. The intensity of it had unsettled her, and she had fled the store as quickly as she could. She spent the rest of the afternoon trying to create a festive atmosphere, a desperate attempt to distract Thomas and herself. They popped corn to string into garlands and cut paper snowflakes to tape to the window panes. But her heart was not in it. Every glance at the empty corner of their small main room was a fresh reminder of her failure. It was just a tree, a simple, silly tree, but it had come to represent so much more. It was a symbol of normalcy, of the life she could no longer provide for her son. As dusk began to bleed into the gray afternoon, a heavy knock echoed on her door. Her heart leaped in her throat. Please, do not let it be Sterling Croft. She could not bear one of his condescending visits today. Thomas ran to the window, peering out into the swirling snow. "Mama, it's the big man from his store," he whispered, his eyes wide. The mountain man. Eleanor's confusion warred with a sudden, inexplicable apprehension. She smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and opened the door a crack. He stood on her small porch, snow dusting the shoulders of his coat and the brim of his hat. He was even larger up close, a figure carved from the very mountains he inhabited. In one hand, he held the reins of his horse, and propped against the porch railing behind him was a Christmas tree. It was perfect, not too large for their small cabin, but full and symmetrical, its branches a deep, healthy green. The scent of fresh pine cut through the cold air. She stared at it, then back at the man's unsmiling face, utterly speechless. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble like rocks shifting deep in the earth. "Figured your boy might have a use for this." He did not wait for a reply. He simply nodded, a short, almost imperceptible gesture, and turned to leave. "Wait," she called out, finding her voice. He stopped but did not turn back immediately. I cannot pay you for this." The words were humiliating to say, but they had to be said. She would not accept charity, not even this. He finally turned his head, his stormy gray eyes meeting hers. There was no pity in them, only a kind of stark, unvarnished fact. Wasn't asking for payment. He paused, and, for a moment, she thought he might say something more, something that would explain this astonishing act. He simply said, "Every child deserves a tree." And with that, he swung himself up onto his horse and disappeared into the snow-filled twilight, leaving Eleanor standing in her doorway with a perfect Christmas tree and a heart full of bewildering gratitude. Caleb rode hard against the storm, the wind a physical force that tried to push him back. He cursed himself for a sentimental fool the entire way home. He had broken his own first rule, do not get involved. He had seen the woman, Eleanor. He had heard Martha Miller call her, and her son watch him from the window as he rode away. He had felt their eyes on his back, a weight of connection he had actively sought to avoid for 5 years. He had left the war behind, or so he had told himself. He had left the noise, the chaos, the betrayals. But he had not left behind the man his father raised, the one who understood duty and honor. That man had chopped down a tree for a widow and her son. And now, as the blizzard howled around his cabin like a wounded animal, that man had to live with the consequences. The primary consequence was a crack in his solitude. He had willingly inserted himself into someone else's story, and he had a grim feeling that the story was not over. The next 2 weeks were a battle against the snow. It fell relentlessly, burying his cabin up to the windowsills. He spent his days chopping wood, tending to Boulder in the small, sturdy barn, and sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle and trying not to think about a woman with sad blue eyes and a proud chin. He failed miserably. Her face was there in the flickering flames, her quiet dignity a stark contrast to the howling fury of the storm outside. He wondered if she and the boy were warm, if they had enough food. He told himself it was none of his business. He had done his part. The transaction was complete, but it did not feel complete. It felt like a beginning. When the storm finally broke, leaving the world pristine and silent under a blanket of white, Caleb knew he had to go back to town. He told himself it was for supplies he had forgotten, a lie so thin he could see right through it. He needed to know they were all right. The thought was a constant, nagging pressure behind his ribs. He saddled Boulder and made the difficult journey, the horse wading through drifts that were chest-deep in places. Flat River looked like a toy town dug out of the snow. He saw Eleanor before she saw him. She was outside her cabin, trying to shovel a path with a shovel that was too large for her, her movements determined but inefficient. The boy, Thomas, was trying to help, his own small shovel making little headway. Caleb felt that same unwelcome tug in his chest. He dismounted, taking his own shovel from his pack. He did not say a word, just walked over and took the shovel from her hands. She startled, her hand flying to her chest, her blue eyes wide with surprise. "You need to angle it," he said, his voice gruff to cover the strange feeling of standing so close to her. "Push from the legs, not your back," he demonstrated, clearing a long swath of heavy, wet snow with a single, powerful motion. Eleanor watched him, a faint blush on her cheeks. "I see," she said softly. "Thank you, mister. I am afraid I do not know your name." "Thorne," he said, not stopping his work. "Caleb Thorne. I am Eleanor Vance. And this is my son, Thomas." The boy looked up at him with a shy awe. "We are very grateful for the tree, Mr. Thorne. It is the most beautiful one we have ever had." Caleb grunted in acknowledgement, his focus entirely on the task. He cleared a path from her door to the woodpile and then to the street. He worked with a relentless, focused energy, the physical labor a welcome outlet for the tension coiling inside him. When he was done, he handed the shovel back to her. Their fingers brushed, a brief contact that sent a jolt through him, as sharp and unexpected as a spark from a flint. He pulled his hand back as if burned. She held out a small, cloth-wrapped bundle. "This is not payment," she said quickly, seeing the refusal in his eyes. "It is a thank you. I do some mending for folks in town. I noticed your coat cuff was frayed when you were here before." He looked down. She was right. The sheepskin was worn through at the cuff. He had not even noticed. He took the bundle reluctantly. Inside was a small piece of expertly stitched leather, a patch designed to reinforce the worn area, along with a sturdy needle and wax thread. It was a practical, thoughtful gift, a gift that showed she had paid attention to him, just as he had to her. This was a recognition of his life, a small but significant acknowledgement. "Thank you," he managed to say. The words felt foreign in his mouth. Their conversation was stilted, full of long pauses, yet underneath the awkwardness, a current of understanding flowed between them. They were two lonely people, survivors in their own right, circling each other with a caution born of past hurts. He learned she was from the East, that her husband had died, and that she was determined to make a life here for her son. She learned nothing about him, because he offered nothing. Yet, in his silence, she seemed to read a story of her own. He left soon after, the small leather patch feeling heavier than a gold coin in his pocket. Back in his cabin that night, by the light of a kerosene lamp, he painstakingly stitched the patch onto his coat cuff. Her work was as fine as she was. He ran his thumb over the neat, strong stitches. This was competence. This was resilience. He was beginning to respect Eleanor Vance more than he had respected anyone in a very long time. And respect, he knew, was a dangerous foundation for other, more complicated feelings. Over the next few months, a fragile routine was established. Whenever Caleb came to town, he would find a reason to check on her. He would drop off a brace of rabbits, claiming he had caught more than he could eat. He would repair a loose shutter on her cabin, grumbling about the shoddy construction. Each time, she would repay him in her own way: a loaf of freshly baked bread, a pair of mended gloves, a jar of wild berry jam. They were small exchanges, barters of kindness that allowed them both to maintain their pride. Their conversations never strayed into personal territory. They spoke of the weather, the price of flour, the best way to bank a fire for the night. Yet in the spaces between their practical words, something grew. He found himself noticing the way the light caught in her hair, the quiet strength in her hands, the intelligence in her eyes. He began to look forward to his trips to town, a feeling that both pleased and terrified him. Eleanor, for her part, found herself watching the road for the sight of his broad shoulders on his buckskin horse. Caleb Thorne was a puzzle. He was gruff, silent, and seemed to carry a world of sorrow within him. Yet his actions spoke of a deep, abiding kindness he tried so hard to conceal. He was protective of her and Thomas in a way that was completely different from Sterling Croft's suffocating possessiveness. Caleb's protection was a shield, held at a distance, asking nothing in return. Croft was a cage, slowly closing in. One afternoon in late February, the sky turned a bruised, ominous yellow. A Chinook wind had brought a fall spring, melting much of the snow, but now the temperature was plummeting. Caleb, in town for supplies, saw it and knew what was coming. A blue norther, a blizzard that would hit without warning and with lethal force. He found Eleanor at the mercantile. "You and the boy need to get home. Now," he said, his voice low and urgent. "A storm is coming. A bad 1 inch." She looked at the sky, her brow furrowed with worry. "I have one more delivery to make for the dress I finished for Mr. Croft's housekeeper." "Leave it," he commanded, his tone sharper than he intended. "Croft can wait. Your safety cannot." The mention of Croft's name put a stubborn glint in her eye. She did not like being told what to do, especially when it involved the man she was trying so hard to keep at arm's length. "I need the money, Mr. Thorne, and it is only just at the edge of town." Before he could argue further, she was gone, her small figure hurrying down the street toward the Croft Ranch, which sat on a rise overlooking the town. He swore under his breath. Her pride was going to get her killed. He quickly bought what he needed and followed, his gut tight with a cold dread. The wind hit just as she was leaving the Croft property. It came with a furious, physical blow, driving a wall of blinding snow before it. The temperature dropped so fast, it was as if a door to a frozen hell had been thrown open. Visibility fell to zero. Caleb could barely see the head of his own horse. He shouted her name, the sound swallowed by the roar of the wind. He found her a quarter-mile down the road, huddled in the lee of a shallow ditch with Thomas, who was crying with cold and fear. Eleanor had wrapped her own shawl around the boy, and her face was already pale, her lips tinged with blue. "My cabin is closer than town," he yelled over the wind. "We have to go now." She was too cold and frightened to argue. He lifted the boy onto the saddle in front of him, wrapping him inside his own heavy coat. He then helped Eleanor mount behind him, her arms circling his waist, her body trembling against his back. The contact was electric, a desperate clinging that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with survival. He urged Boulder into the white chaos, praying he could find the trail home. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at them, and the snow was so thick he could only navigate by instinct, by the feel of the land beneath Boulder's hooves. He could feel Eleanor's strength failing, her shivers growing more violent. He kept talking to her, forcing her to answer, to stay awake. When the dark shape of his cabin finally loomed out of the swirling snow, relief washed over him so intensely his knees felt weak. He half carried her inside, setting her down in the single chair by the cold hearth while he got a fire roaring in the stone fireplace. He stripped the wet, frozen outer layers from both her and the boy, wrapping them in thick wool blankets he kept stored in a chest. He worked with a detached efficiency, his focus narrowed to the task of saving them. He brewed coffee, lacing it with a little of his precious whiskey, and forced Eleanor to drink. He rubbed her hands and feet until the feeling began to return. Thomas, exhausted and overwhelmed, had fallen asleep almost instantly, tucked into Caleb's own bunk. Finally, with the fire blazing and the cabin beginning to warm, Caleb sat back on his heels. Eleanor was huddled in the chair, her eyes huge in her pale face, watching him. The storm raged outside, sealing them in, creating an intimacy that was both terrifying and profound. "You saved us," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He just shook his head, staring into the fire. "You shouldn't have gone out there." "I know," she said softly. "It was foolish. But Mr. Croft, he is not a patient man, and I needed the payment." For a long time, they sat in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the scream of the wind. The small, one-room cabin felt charged with unspoken emotions. Here, in his fortress of solitude, was the very complication he had sworn to avoid. A woman, a child, and a storm that showed no signs of letting up. Later that night, with Thomas still sleeping soundly, the quiet between them shifted. It was no longer awkward, but contemplative. The shared brush with death had stripped away their pretenses. "Why did you come here?" Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "To these mountains?" Caleb was quiet for so long she thought he would not answer. He stared into the flames, but she knew he was seeing something else entirely. "I was at Shiloh," he said finally, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "And Vicksburg, and a dozen other places that are best forgotten." He did not need to say more. The names of the battles were enough. She had lost cousins at Shiloh. She understood the shadow that war cast over a man's soul. "You were a soldier." "I was," he said. "I saw what men are capable of. The noise, the hate. When it was over, I just wanted quiet." He looked around the cabin at the sturdy log walls he had raised himself. "I wanted a place where the only sounds were the wind and the river. A place where I did not have to be responsible for anyone but myself." Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I understand wanting quiet," she said. "After Edward died, the condolences, the pitying looks, it was all so loud. I felt like I was suffocating." She paused, her gaze turning inward. "We came here for a new beginning." He was so full of life, so certain we would build a dynasty. He saw opportunity. I just saw space, a place where we could breathe. And then he was gone, and all this space just felt empty. This was it, the shared confession of trauma, spoken into the warm, firelit dark. He had lost his faith in humanity in the crucible of war. She had lost her future to the whims of fate. They were both scarred, both survivors who had sought refuge in a hard land. In that moment, he saw her not as a fragile widow, but as a fellow soldier in a different kind of war. She was fighting for her son, for her independence, for a small patch of ground to call her own. He felt a powerful, unexpected urge to reach out, to touch her, to offer a comfort that went beyond blankets and warm coffee. He resisted, clenching his fists. Such gestures were not for him. They belonged to a life he had left behind. But the feeling remained, a warm ember in the cold ashes of his heart. He was beginning to realize that the walls of his solitude, which he had thought were made of stone, were perhaps more fragile than he knew. And the woman sitting across from him, with her quiet strength and sorrowful eyes, was the one who was threatening to bring them down. They were trapped together for 3 days. The blizzard raged, a relentless white fury that cut them off from the world. In the close confines of the cabin, a new rhythm developed. It was a domesticity Caleb had not experienced in years. He tended the fire and hunted small game close to the cabin when the wind died down. Eleanor cooked, her quiet competence transforming his meager supplies into savory, comforting meals. She organized his shelves, mended his shirts, and brought a sense of order to his bachelor existence that he found both unsettling and deeply pleasant. Thomas, recovering his boyish energy, explored every corner of the small cabin. He was fascinated by Caleb, following him around and peppering him with endless questions. Caleb, who had never been around children, found himself responding with a gruff patience he did not know he possessed. He showed the boy how to carve a piece of wood into a rough-hewn bird, a small, tender gesture that made Eleanor's heart ache with a strange, new emotion. Watching this big, silent man gently guide her son's small hands was a vision of life she had thought was lost to her forever. The attraction between them grew with every shared glance, every accidental brush of hands as they worked in the small space. It was a silent, powerful current running beneath the surface of their practical conversations. Caleb found himself watching her as she read to Thomas by the fire, the soft light illuminating the curve of her cheek, and he would have to turn away, his own feelings a confusing storm inside him. He had chosen isolation for a reason. These feelings, this warmth, this longing, were a complication, a danger. They made him vulnerable, and vulnerability was a luxury a man like him could not afford. Eleanor, too, felt the pull. She saw the man beneath the gruff exterior. She saw the deep well of loneliness in his eyes, but also the steadfast honor that guided his every action. He was a good man, a strong man, and as she lay in the makeshift bed he had made for her near the fire, listening to the sound of his steady breathing from the bunk across the room, she felt safer than she had since Edward died. The feeling was both a comfort and a betrayal to her grief. When the storm finally broke and the sun shone on a world of blinding white, the spell was broken. The reality of their situation returned. As soon as the trail was passable, he would have to take them back to town. The thought of his cabin returning to its empty silence left a hollow feeling in Caleb's chest. The ride back to Flat River was quiet, charged with unspoken words. When they reached her small cabin, the first thing they saw was a set of fresh tracks in the snow leading to her door. A large, expensive sleigh was tied up nearby. Sterling Croft stood on her porch, his arms crossed, his handsome face marred by an ugly scowl. "So, this is where you have been," Croft said, his voice dripping with condescension as he looked from Eleanor to Caleb. He completely ignored Thomas, enjoying the hospitality of this mountain man. Eleanor's chin went up. "Mr. Thorne saved my son and me from the blizzard, Mr. Croft. We owe him our lives." Croft's eyes, cold and calculating, flicked to Caleb. It was a look of assessment, dismissing Caleb as a worthless obstacle. "I came to check on you, Eleanor, as a concerned neighbor. When I found you gone, I was worried. It seems my worry was misplaced." His gaze lingered on her, proprietary and insulting. "But a widow must be careful of the company she keeps. People will talk." Caleb felt a surge of cold fury. The casual way Croft spoke her name, the implication in his tone, it was all designed to diminish her and assert his own claim. Caleb dismounted, moving to stand between Croft and Eleanor. He did not say a word. He simply stood there, his height and the sheer, solid presence of him a silent warning. "This is not your concern, Thorne," Croft sneered, taking a small step back despite his bravado. "She said she owes me her life," Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. "That makes it my concern." This was the protective confrontation, a line drawn in the snow. He was no longer a passive observer. He had chosen a side. Croft's face tightened with rage. He was not used to being challenged. "You will regret this," he hissed, his threat hanging in the cold air. He turned on his heel, climbed into his sleigh, and left, the runners cutting deep, angry lines in the snow. Eleanor let out a shaky breath she did not realize she had been holding. "Thank you," she said, looking up at Caleb. "You did not have to do that." "Yes," he said, his gray eyes holding hers. "I did." He helped her and Thomas inside, then turned to leave. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was far from over. Sterling Croft was a man who did not tolerate losing, and he had just made it clear that he considered Eleanor a prize to be won. And Caleb Thorne, the man who wanted nothing more than to be left alone, had just stepped directly into the path of a very dangerous man. The aftermath of the confrontation with Croft was a tense, waiting quiet. Caleb returned to his mountain, but the solitude he had once cherished now felt like an empty ache. He could not stop thinking about Eleanor and Thomas, about the threat that hung over them. Croft was a man of influence and few scruples. He owned the bank, had the sheriff in his pocket, or so it was rumored, and treated the valley as his personal fiefdom. A week later, Caleb's fears were realized. He rode into town to find Eleanor in a state of quiet desperation. Sheriff Brody, a man whose weary expression suggested he was perpetually caught between the law and powerful interests, had just left her cabin. What did he want? Caleb asked, his voice tight. Eleanor's hands were twisting a piece of cloth in her lap. Sterling Croft filed a complaint with the circuit judge, she said, her voice trembling slightly. He's claiming I am an unfit mother, that I live in poverty and recklessly endanger my son by consorting with disreputable characters. Her eyes met his, full of shame and fear. He means you, Caleb. He's going to try to have Thomas taken from me, to have him made a ward of the county. The cold fury returned, sharper and more focused this time. It was a vile, cowardly attack, aimed at her most vulnerable point. Croft could not have her, so he would take her son. He would break her spirit and leave her with no choice but to turn to him. Caleb saw the whole disgusting plan laid out before him. The judge is in Croft's pocket, Caleb stated. It was not a question. She nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Sheriff Brody said as much. He said he is sorry, but his hands are tied. The judge will be here in a month. He will hold a hearing, and Croft will have a dozen paid witnesses to say whatever he wants. The sheriff said, my only hope is to not be a single woman. A boy needs a father, the judge will say. A home needs a man. Caleb stood in the middle of her small, tidy cabin, the world narrowing to the terrified look in her eyes. All his instincts screamed at him to run, to retreat back to his mountain and pull the silence around him like a shroud. This was the exact entanglement he had spent 5 years avoiding. A fight that was not his, a life that was not his. But then he looked at Thomas, who was watching them with wide, frightened eyes, and he looked at Eleanor, who was facing the loss of the one thing she had left to live for. His solitude suddenly seemed a small, selfish thing. What was the point of being honorable if you only practiced it when it was easy? What was the point of surviving a war if you were not willing to fight for someone who could not fight for themselves? His own past, the family he had lost, the future he had given up on, it all coalesced into a single, stark moment of decision. He could walk away and live with the ghost of her face for the rest of his days, or he could stand and fight. He took a deep breath. The words came out before he had fully formed them in his mind, a product of pure, gut-level conviction. This was the commitment crucible. Marry me. Eleanor stared at him, her blue eyes wide with disbelief. What? Marry me, he repeated, his voice steady and resolute. Croft is trying to take your son because you are a widow alone. If you are my wife, if Thomas has a father and a protector, the judge will have no grounds. We will tell him we have been courting since the winter. It gives you a home. It gives the boy a name. It is a legal shield. She stood up, her expression a whirlwind of confusion, desperation, and a flicker of something he could not name. You cannot be serious. We barely know each other. Why would you do this? You value your solitude above all else. Croft will not win, he said, the words coming from a place deeper than reason. I will not let him. What he's doing is wrong. Sometimes you have to fight, and this is the only way to win this particular battle. He looked at her, his gaze unwavering. It would be a marriage in name, a practical arrangement, to protect you and the boy. Nothing more, unless you wished it. The last words were an admission he had not intended to make, a crack in his stoic facade. Eleanor searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit or ulterior motive. She found only a raw, unvarnished earnestness. He was offering her a lifeline, a sacrifice of the very peace he held so dear. It was an act of profound, astonishing honor, and in her heart, she knew that a marriage of convenience to Caleb Thorne would be more real, more true, than anything Sterling Croft could ever offer. And what of you? She asked softly. What do you get from this arrangement? He thought for a moment. I get to know that a good woman and her son are safe, he said simply. And maybe I get a little less quiet. Tears welled in her eyes again. But this time they were not tears of fear. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking gratitude. She knew the cost of his offer, but she also knew the cost of refusal. She looked at her son, and her decision was made. Yes, she whispered. All right, Caleb. I will marry you. She added her own condition, her voice gaining strength. But I will not be a burden. This will be a partnership. I will pull my weight. I will contribute to our home. On that, I insist. He gave a single, sharp nod. I would expect nothing less. They went to see Sheriff Brody the next morning. The lawman listened to their plan, his weathered face unreadable. He looked from Caleb's resolute expression to Eleanor's determined one. He stroked his chin, his eyes shrewd. Croft will be furious, Brody said. Let him be, Caleb replied. A slow smile spread across the sheriff's face. The circuit preacher is in town. Came in yesterday. I reckon he could be persuaded to perform a ceremony this afternoon. Might as well make it official before Croft gets wind of it. He looked at Caleb, a newfound respect in his eyes. It's a good thing you're doing, Thorne. The wedding was a hasty, surreal affair. It took place in the sheriff's small office, with Brody and his wife as witnesses. The circuit preacher, a thin man with kind eyes, read the simple vows. Eleanor, wearing her best dress, a simple gray wool, stood beside Caleb, her hand trembling slightly in his. Caleb felt a strange sense of unreality. Caleb Thorne, the man who had turned his back on the world, was taking a wife. He looked down at Eleanor. The afternoon light from the window caught the gold in her hair. She looked beautiful and brave and utterly terrified. He felt a fierce wave of protectiveness wash over him. This was real, and he would not fail her. When the preacher said, "You may kiss the bride," an awkward silence fell over the room. Caleb hesitated, then leaned down. He brushed his lips against hers, a chaste, brief kiss that was meant to be for show. But the moment their lips touched, something shifted. It was a spark of warmth, a promise of something more than just a practical arrangement. It was emotionally charged, sealing a contract that both of them knew was about to change their lives forever. When they pulled apart, her eyes were shining with unshed tears. They were man and wife. The first battle against Sterling Croft had been won, but they both knew the war was just beginning. News of the marriage spread through Flat River like a prairie fire. By nightfall, everyone knew, which meant Sterling Croft knew. Caleb moved Eleanor and Thomas's few belongings up to his cabin that same afternoon. The small space was suddenly crowded, filled with the scent of Eleanor's lavender soap and the sound of Thomas's laughter. It no longer felt empty. It felt like a home. The transformation was both jarring and deeply welcome. The first few days of their marriage were a delicate dance of discovery. They were two strangers bound by a legal document, learning the rhythms of living together. But beneath the polite courtesies, the bond that had been forged in the blizzard deepened. They worked side by side, falling into a partnership that felt surprisingly natural. He taught her how to track, how to read the weather in the clouds. She taught him about the books she had read, bringing a world of ideas and stories into his quiet life. They slept separately, he on a bedroll by the fire, she and Thomas in his bunk. But the nights were charged with an unspoken tension. He would lie awake, listening to her soft breathing, his body aching with a longing he refused to acknowledge. He had married her to protect her, not to claim a husband's rights. He would honor the terms of their arrangement, no matter how difficult it was. A week after the wedding, the final showdown they had been waiting for arrived. Caleb was chopping wood when he saw them, a party of 5 riders coming up the trail, led by Sterling Croft. They were armed. "Eleanor, take Thomas to the root cellar," Caleb said, his voice calm and cold as he walked back into the cabin. "Bar the door from the inside and do not come out, no matter what you hear." She looked at him, her face pale with fear. "Caleb, what are you going to do?" "What's necessary," he said. He took his army-issue rifle from its pegs over the mantel, his movements economical and precise. He checked the load with a practiced efficiency that sent a chill down her spine. This was the soldier he had been, awakened from his slumber. "No," she said, her voice firm. "This is my fight, too. I will not hide while you face them alone." She grabbed his spare shotgun from the corner. "Edward taught me how to use this. I'm not a good shot, but I can reload for you." He looked at her, at the raw courage shining in her eyes, and he felt a surge of love so powerful it almost staggered him. He had married her to protect her, but here she was, ready to stand and fight beside him. She was not a damsel in distress. She was his partner. "All right," he said with a grim nod. "Stay away from the window." Croft and his men reined in their horses 100 yards from the cabin. "Thorne!" Croft's voice was a furious shout. "Send her out. You have taken what is mine, and I have come to collect it. She is my wife." Caleb yelled back, his voice echoing in the mountain quiet. "She belongs to no one but herself. Ride out now, Croft, or be carried out." A shot rang out, and a bullet splintered the wood of the doorframe. The fight had begun. Caleb returned fire, his shot taking one of Croft's men out of the saddle. The others scattered, taking cover behind the trees and rocks. The siege of his small homestead had started. For the next hour, a fierce gunfight raged. Caleb was a master of his craft, his shots carefully aimed, his movements calculated. He moved from the window to the door, using the solid log walls of his cabin for cover. Eleanor stayed low, her initial fear replaced by a focused resolve. She laid out ammunition, her hands steady as she reloaded the spare rifle and shotgun, passing them to him as needed. They worked together in a seamless, desperate rhythm, a husband and wife defending their home. Caleb took a bullet in the arm, a searing pain that made him grunt and stumble. Eleanor was there instantly, tearing a strip from her petticoat to make a bandage, her touch gentle but firm as she staunched the bleeding. "You cannot stop," she urged, her eyes locked on his. He nodded, the pain a distant roar as adrenaline surged through him. They were outnumbered, and he knew it. Croft's men were closing in, moving from cover to cover. It was only a matter of time. He was preparing to make a last, desperate stand when he heard it, a whistle from down the valley, followed by the thunder of more horses. Sheriff Brody and a posse of half a dozen townsmen broke through the trees, their rifles blazing. The unexpected arrival turned the tide. Croft's men, caught between two fires, lost their nerve. Two of them threw down their guns and surrendered. Croft, his face a mask of insane fury, saw his prize being snatched away. He let out a roar of frustration and spurred his horse directly at the cabin, his pistol raised, aimed at the open doorway where Caleb stood. Caleb raised his rifle, but his wounded arm was slow. He knew he would not be fast enough. In that split second, a blast from beside him rocked the cabin. Eleanor, holding the shotgun with both hands, its stock braced against her hip, had fired. The buckshot caught Croft square in the chest, throwing him from his horse. He landed in the snow and did not move again. Silence descended, broken only by the panting breaths of the survivors and the wind sighing through the pines. The threat was neutralized. It was over. Sheriff Brody dismounted, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. He looked at Croft's body, then at Caleb and Eleanor standing in the doorway of their cabin, covered in dust and gunpowder. "Looks like you two can handle your own troubles," the sheriff said, a note of deep respect in his voice. "But I figured you might appreciate the help." He rounded up the remaining hired guns. "This is over, Eleanor. You and the boy are safe now." In the immediate aftermath, once the sheriff and his posse had departed with their prisoners and the body of Sterling Croft, a profound quiet settled over the homestead. The air, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder, slowly cleared, leaving only the clean scent of pine and snow. Caleb and Eleanor stood in the middle of their small, damaged cabin, the adrenaline of the fight slowly ebbing away, leaving a shaky exhaustion in its place. Caleb looked at his wife. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair had come undone, and there was a fierceness in her eyes he had never seen before. She had not flinched. She had stood by him. She had saved his life. The love he felt for her was no longer a quiet ember. It was a roaring fire, a certainty that filled every part of him. "Eleanor," he began, his voice rough with emotion. He reached out with his good hand, gently brushing a stray piece of hair from her cheek. "Our marriage, it started as an arrangement, a way to protect you." Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. "I know. It is not that anymore," he said, his gaze intense and unwavering. "Not for me. When I saw Croft aiming at you, and when you stood beside me, I knew. I love you, Eleanor. I think I have from a moment I saw you, trying to hide a tear over a Christmas tree." A sob escaped her lips, a sound of relief and joy. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, stepping into his embrace, careful of his wounded arm. She pressed her face against his chest, her arms wrapping around his strong back. "I love you, too. I was so afraid to admit it, even to myself. I thought I was just being grateful. But it is more. You are the kindest, most honorable man I have ever known. You made me feel safe, not just from Croft, but from the world." He held her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing her in. The walls he had built around his heart had not just been breached. They had been utterly demolished, and in their place, something new and beautiful was being built. They stood there for a long time, holding each other, two survivors who had found in each other not just a refuge, but a home. That night, for the first time, he did not sleep on the floor. He shared the bunk with his wife, and their marriage became real in every sense of the word. They began to plan their future, their words quiet but full of hope in the darkness. "We will expand the cabin," Caleb said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. "Add another room for Thomas, and a proper kitchen for you. We will plant a garden in the spring," she added, her hand tracing the muscles of his chest. "And get some chickens. Thomas would love that. We will build a life here," he said, his voice thick with a conviction he had not felt in years. "A good one. Together." They were no longer just two people bound by circumstance. They were a family, forged in adversity and sealed by love. The quiet he had once sought in the mountains had been replaced by a different kind of peace, the peace of a shared life, of a home filled with warmth and love. 5 years later, the cabin was no longer a small, solitary box against the wilderness. A new wing extended from one side, its windows warm with lamplight against the deepening twilight. The barn was larger, and the cheerful sounds of chickens and a milk cow drifted on the crisp autumn air. A fenced garden, dormant for the winter, showed the rich, dark soil of a successful harvest. The Thorne homestead was thriving. Inside, the scent of roasting venison and baking bread filled the air. Eleanor, her figure fuller now, moved about the warm, spacious kitchen with a contented grace. A small, dark-haired girl of 4, with her father's stormy gray eyes, sat at the big wooden table, carefully drawing a picture of a horse. Thomas, now a sturdy boy of 12, sat by the fire, reading a book. He was tall for his age, with a quiet confidence that had been absent when he first arrived on this mountain. He looked up as the door opened, a smile touching his lips. Caleb stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold, pine-scented air with him. He was broader now, the lines on his face softened by years of peace and happiness. He shrugged off his heavy coat and went straight to Eleanor, kissing her soundly. "It is all done," he said. "The last of the logs for the new schoolhouse are stacked and ready." Eleanor smiled, her hand resting on her gently rounded belly. "The whole town is grateful, Caleb. A real school. It is a dream come true for so many." It had been her dream, one he had worked tirelessly to help her realize. He looked around the room, his gaze resting on each of his family members. On Thomas, who he loved as his own son. On his daughter, Sarah, who was the light of his life. And on Eleanor, his wife, his partner, the woman who had brought him back from the wilderness of his own soul. He saw the new life growing within her and felt a profound sense of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. Later that night, after the children were asleep, he and Eleanor sat on the porch, wrapped together in a thick quilt against the chill. The sky was a vast canopy of brilliant, diamond-hard stars. The silence of the mountains was no longer a refuge from the world, but a peaceful blanket over their lives. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The quiet? The solitude?" He tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer. He thought back to the man he had been, the haunted loner who believed survival meant being alone. He had been wrong. True survival, he now knew, was not about isolation. It was about connection. It was about having something, someone to fight for. "No," he said, his voice resonating with deep, unshakable truth as he pressed a kiss to her temple. "All the quiet in the world is not worth a single day without this. Without you for her." He had faced down his own ghosts and a very real enemy. For her, he had built a life. He looked into her eyes, the same clear blue that had captivated him from the very beginning, and he knew he would do it all again. For her, anything,